At 9:42 a.m. on June 19, 1944, Major Robert Morton Neiman crouched inside the steel confines of his M4 Sherman on Saipan, watching Japanese gunners methodically walk their fire toward his company. Neiman was 32 years old. He commanded Company C, 4th Tank Battalion. He already wore a Navy Cross. None of that mattered now. Ahead of him, 200 yards of open ground led straight into a fortified ridge. The Japanese had turned it into a killing zone. At least 12 75mm anti-tank guns sealed inside concrete bunkers, supported by heavy mortars and machine gun nests carved directly into volcanic rock. Every approach was covered. Every mistake would be punished. Neiman's Sherman lurched forward with 11 other tanks, engines roaring, tracks grinding into black ash. Inside the turret, the heat was unbearable, well over 100 degrees. Sweat poured down his loader's face, soaking his uniform before the first shot was fired. They advanced 70 yards. Then the world exploded. A direct hit slammed into Neiman's tank, large caliber, unmistakable. The impact threw him hard against the turret wall. The engine compartment filled instantly with thick black smoke, choking and blinding. Japanese machine guns opened up, stitching the hull with sparks as the crew bailed out through the hatches. Neiman hit the ground running. He sprinted 40 yards through open fire and vaulted into the commander's hatch of another Sherman in his platoon, bullets snapping off the armor around him. The tank surged forward. 30 yards later, the left track detonated. A landmine. The Sherman pivoted violently, slamming Neiman into the gun breech with enough force to crack 2 ribs. The driver fought the controls, but the damage was final. 70-pound track links lay scattered across the volcanic ash. The tank was immobilized, alive, exposed, and doomed. Neiman ordered the crew out. Then he ran again. Under mortar fire, he covered 20 yards to a third Sherman waiting behind the line, climbed in, and took command without pause. This time, the tank broke through. Its gun roared. 2 machine gun bunkers vanished. A mortar pit was obliterated. The attack succeeded, but the cost was savage. By nightfall, Company C had lost 6 Shermans. 14 tankers were dead or wounded. And this was only one day on Saipan. The 4th Marine Division had landed 4 days earlier with 68 tanks. Within a week, Japanese mines and anti-tank guns had destroyed or disabled 23 of them, nearly 1/3 of the division's armor. Neiman began to see the pattern. The mines were everywhere. Japanese engineers had seeded every approach with anti-tank mines, anti-personnel charges, and improvised explosives made from aircraft bombs. Marine engineers worked with metal detectors under fire, clearing lanes inch by inch, but there were never enough of them. Tanks outran the cleared paths, strayed by yards, and paid for it in smoke and steel. Armor was being lost not to maneuver, but to immobility. The battalion needed a way to clear mines faster, at tank speed. Neiman remembered something he had read months earlier in an armored warfare journal that reached Maui: British mine-flail tanks. Rotating chains that struck the ground ahead of the vehicle, detonating mines before they could cripple the tracks. The Scorpion. The Crab. But the Marines had none. Every British flail tank was in Europe, supporting Normandy. On Saipan, Neiman had nothing but wrecked Shermans, growing casualty lists, and a problem that demanded a solution immediately. The Pacific always got hand-me-downs. Whatever the Army didn't want. Whatever arrived late. Whatever wasn't considered essential for Europe. That was the reality Major Robert Morton Neiman understood all too well. After Saipan, the 4th Marine Division rotated to Maui to rest, refit, and rebuild. The next assault was already coming. Intelligence reports were clear. The Japanese were fortifying the next objective heavily. More bunkers, more guns, and inevitably, more mines. Neiman knew what that meant. More burning tanks, more immobilized crews, more Marines dying because steel couldn't move. In November 1944, Neiman walked the 4th Tank Battalion motor pool on Maui. Rows of Shermans sat under camouflage netting, mechanics working through the damage left by Saipan, bent suspensions, cracked gearboxes, shattered final drives. At the far end of the lot sat a battered M4A2 dozer tank, its armor scarred and its blade assembly removed. Someone had painted a name on its hull before Saipan. Joker. The tank had been damaged in combat and pulled from service. The Marine Corps was transitioning to the newer gasoline-powered 4A3S. Diesel Shermans like Joker were obsolete. This one was scheduled for the scrap heap. Neiman stopped and stared at it. Then he looked past the tank, to the vehicle graveyard, where maintenance crews stripped wrecks for usable parts. Axles, gearboxes, scrap steel, piles of twisted metal waiting to be cut apart. And in that moment, Neiman had an idea that would either save hundreds of Marines or get him laughed out of the battalion. The next morning, he called a meeting in the company tent. Officers, senior NCOs. No paperwork, no manuals. Neiman spread a rough sketch across the table. It showed a Sherman tank with a large rotating drum mounted to the front. Heavy chains hung from the drum, long enough to strike the ground ahead of the tracks. The idea was simple, brutal, effective. When the chains hit a mine, it would detonate in front of the tank, not under it. The officers studied the drawing. Some frowned. Some leaned closer. Lieutenant Bob Reed, Neiman's executive officer, pointed out the obvious problem. How do you power it? A tank engine drives the tracks, he said. Everything else runs off batteries or muscle. Neiman nodded. We'll figure that out as we go. What he needed now were men who weren't afraid to cut holes in government property, weld parts that had never been meant to fit together, and ignore every technical manual ever written. One man stepped forward immediately. Gunnery Sergeant Sam Johnston. Johnston was the best mechanic in the battalion. He'd been working on tanks since 1941. He had served with the 1st Marine Division on Guadalcanal, keeping Shermans running in heat, mud, and conditions that should have killed them. I can make it work, Johnston said. If you give me Staff Sergeant Ray Shaw and access to the graveyard. Shaw was the battalion's chief maintenance NCO. Between the two of them, they had rebuilt dozens of Shermans from wrecks officially written off as total losses. Neiman didn't hesitate. He gave them authorization. He told them to requisition whatever they needed. And he told them not to ask permission twice. For the next 2 days, Johnston and Shaw combed through piles of destroyed vehicles. They needed something that could rotate under power and survive repeated impacts. Aircraft components were too delicate. Tank components were too heavy. On the 3rd day, they found it. A destroyed 2.5-ton truck sat half-buried in scrap. Its rear axle and differential were still intact. The axle was nearly 6 feet long. The differential in the center would allow the shaft to rotate freely under load. It was perfect. They dragged it off the truck frame with a crane and hauled it into the motor pool. The plan took shape over the next week. A heavy steel frame would be welded to the front of Joker, bolted into the mounting points where the dozer blade hydraulics had once been. The axle would be mounted horizontally across the front. Chains would be attached along its length. Power would come from the tank itself, somehow. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't in any manual. But it was exactly the kind of solution the Pacific demanded. And if it worked, the next island wouldn't be paid for in burning tanks. The concept was simple. Mount the truck axle horizontally at the end of the steel frame. The differential in the center would become the rotation point. Heavy chains would be bolted along the axle at regular intervals. When the axle spun fast enough, centrifugal force would sling the chains outward, turning them into flailing steel whips. Anything buried in the ground ahead of the tank, anti-tank mines, pressure detonators, improvised charges, would be struck and detonated safely away from the hull. Simple physics. Catastrophic results. But power was still the problem. A Sherman's engine drove the tracks. There was no provision for powering external machinery. What Johnston needed was a way to tap into that power without tearing the tank apart. He found the solution in a wrecked Jeep. Buried in the vehicle graveyard was a shattered frame with its transmission still intact. Small enough to fit inside the Sherman's hull. Rugged enough to take abuse. Designed to handle torque and sudden load changes. Johnston dragged it into the motor pool and did something that, under normal circumstances, would have ended his Marine Corps career. He cut a hole through the front armor of the Sherman. Just left of the bow machine gun position, he drilled and torch-cut a circular opening roughly 4 inches in diameter straight through the frontal plate. No paperwork. No approval. Just steel giving way under sparks. Through that hole, he ran a drive shaft from inside the tank to the differential on the flail frame. Inside the hull, Johnston bolted the Jeep transmission directly to the floor plates. He meshed it with the Sherman's drivetrain using a series of improvised gears and belts. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't balanced. But it transferred power. The bow gunner would control everything. One lever engaged or disengaged the flail. Another controlled rotation speed. The hydraulic controls from the old dozer blade were repurposed to raise or lower the entire assembly, allowing the chains to skim the ground or lift clear during movement. Neiman knew they'd need help to make it survive. The 127th Naval Construction Battalion, the Seabees, were stationed on Maui. They had industrial welding equipment, heavy tools, and men who understood how to build structures meant to be abused. Neiman explained what he was trying to do. There were no formal orders, no blueprints, just Marines helping Marines. For 3 weeks, the project consumed a corner of the motor pool. Steel was cut, frames were welded, supports were reinforced. By early December, the vehicle sat finished beneath the palm trees. It looked like nothing anyone had ever seen. A Sherman tank with a truck axle protruding from its nose, like a medieval weapon bolted to modern armor. Heavy chains, each nearly 3 feet long, hung from the axle in a brutal ring. Thick weld beads covered the mounting frame. Steel plates partially enclosed the differential housing, though full armor protection would come later, after the first test showed how badly it was needed. Johnston climbed into the bow gunner's seat. Mechanics gathered at a safe distance. He engaged the drive. The Jeep transmission caught. Power flowed through the shaft. The axle began to rotate, slow at first, then faster. The chains lifted from the ground, snapping outward as centrifugal force took over. The sound was violent, steel chains tearing through air, a mechanical roar that echoed across the motor pool. Men came running from other shops. Johnston increased speed. The chains blurred into a spinning curtain of metal. He slowed it down. The rotation dropped smoothly. He raised the assembly. The chains climbed higher. He lowered it again. The chains struck the ground and exploded dirt and rock outward, spraying the motor pool with debris as they churned through the soil. The control system worked perfectly, but no one was celebrating yet. Because this was still theory. Real mines didn't behave like dirt. Explosions could shatter chains. Shrapnel could rip apart the differential. One bad detonation might tear the entire front end off the tank. The only way to know was to drive it into a minefield. And that test was coming. They needed proof. Theory and welding meant nothing unless the machine could survive real explosives. That meant laying an actual minefield and driving straight through it. In mid-December, division commanders approved the test. That approval alone was extraordinary. Senior officers rarely authorized deliberate mine detonations on training ground. One mistake could destroy a tank, kill experienced crewmen, or cripple a battalion asset. But intelligence reports from the Pacific were clear. Iwo Jima would be mined heavily. If this worked, it could save dozens, maybe hundreds, of lives. Marine engineers selected an empty stretch of ground roughly half a mile from the motor pool. They buried captured Japanese anti-tank mines taken on Saipan, Type 93s. Ceramic-cased, pressure-detonated, packed with 22 pounds of explosive each. Enough to shear a Sherman's track clean off. Enough to kill the crew if detonated under the hull. The engineers placed them deliberately. Some shallow, some deep, some isolated, others clustered together. Exactly the way Japanese defenders seeded approaches to bunkers and ridgelines. 30 to 40 yards of lethal ground. Word spread quickly. Tankers left their maintenance work. Mechanics drifted in from the motor pool. Infantry Marines from nearby units showed up, drawn by rumor and curiosity. Nearly 100 men formed a loose perimeter around the test site, staying well back from the minefield. At the edge of the danger zone sat the Joker. Engine running. Exhaust rolling. The flail assembly lowered into position. Johnston was in the bow gunner's seat, hands on the controls. An experienced driver sat at the helm. Neiman stood 50 yards away, arms folded, watching. This would either justify 3 weeks of unauthorized work or end the experiment permanently. Johnston engaged the drive. The Jeep transmission caught. The axle spun up. The chains lifted and blurred into motion, the sound overwhelming. Steel slicing through air, a mechanical roar that drowned out voices and engines alike. The driver released the brake. The Sherman rolled forward at walking speed, 2 miles per hour. The spinning chains struck the ground ahead of the tank. Dirt erupted outward in violent arcs as the flail tore into the soil, digging furrows and pulverizing the surface. Then the first mine detonated. A massive blast. Debris shot 50 feet into the air. Smoke and dust swallowed the tank completely. For a moment, no one could see anything. Then the Sherman emerged. still moving. The chains were still spinning. The flail assembly was intact. Another explosion. Then another. The mines were detonating ahead of the tank, exactly as intended. Each blast erupted forward of the hull, sending shockwaves outward while the Sherman continued crawling through the chaos. The Marines watching stood frozen. This wasn't a demonstration. It was sustained violence. Continuous detonations ripped through the minefield as the flail found every buried charge in its path. Smoke and dust thickened until the tank vanished completely from view. Only the engine's steady growl and the relentless roar of spinning chains confirmed it was still advancing. 30 yards in. 35. Explosions rippled in sequence, one after another, marching forward with the tank. 40 yards. The Sherman burst out the far side of the minefield. The driver halted. Johnston disengaged the mechanism. The axle slowed. The chains dropped and hung motionless. The sudden silence was almost jarring after the sustained thunder. Marines rushed forward. The Joker was filthy, coated in dirt, ash, and scorch marks, but it was intact. The hull was unbreached. The flail frame was scarred but standing. The chains were battered but unbroken. Every mine had detonated. The lane was clear. What had started as scrap metal and unauthorized welding had just proven itself against real explosives. And everyone watching knew the same thing. This machine was going to war. The chains had taken punishment. Several links were visibly bent, their edges blunted by repeated blasts, but every chain remained attached to the axle. The frame held. The flail assembly had survived its first real trial. Johnston climbed out of the bow gunner's hatch and walked forward, boots crunching on scorched earth. He crouched beneath the flail frame and inspected the differential housing. That's where they saw it. A jagged fragment of metal, roughly the size of a man's thumb, had punched through the underside of the differential casing. Shrapnel from one of the detonations. The steel there had been too thin. The differential itself still turned freely. No seized gears. No visible internal damage. But the vulnerability was obvious. In combat, luck mattered. And a single fragment in the wrong place could cripple the entire mechanism at the worst possible moment, halfway through a minefield, with infantry depending on the tank to keep moving. That afternoon, Shaw and the Seabees went to work. No paperwork. No waiting for approval. Steel plate was cut. Welding torches roared to life. Over the next 2 days, they encased the differential housing in armor, quarter-inch steel plates welded together into a box that wrapped completely around the vulnerable components. The welds weren't pretty, but they were solid. When they finished, the front of the tank looked even more brutal, an armored block jutting forward beneath the spinning axle, clearly improvised, clearly built for survival. 4 days later, they ran the second test. Another minefield. Same layout. Same captured Japanese mines. The Joker rolled forward. The flail spun. The explosions came in sequence, just as before. When the tank emerged, Johnston inspected the housing again. This time, the added armor bore multiple impact marks, but no penetrations. Shrapnel had bounced cleanly off the plates. The vulnerability was gone. The solution had worked. Neiman submitted a written report to battalion headquarters detailing both tests. 2 separate minefields cleared, 40 yards each. Less than 5 minutes total. No engineers exposed. No casualties. All detonations absorbed ahead of the hull. The battalion commander approved moving forward. Division wanted to see it. A formal demonstration was scheduled for late December. Infantry battalion commanders would attend, the men who would rely on tanks to break through Japanese defenses. Artillery officers, logistics staff, even a handful of Army observers stationed on Maui. This was the moment the flail tank had to prove it wasn't just a clever experiment, but a combat-worthy weapon that deserved a place on Iwo Jima. The demonstration was set for December 28th. In the days leading up to it, Neiman became obsessive. Chains inspected and replaced where needed. Drive system tested again and again. Hydraulics checked, then checked once more. Johnston practiced engaging and disengaging the mechanism until it was muscle memory, smooth, controlled, repeatable. The morning of December 28th arrived clear and warm. Neiman reached the demonstration site at 0700 to supervise final preparations. Chairs were arranged for visiting officers. The minefield was ready. The Joker sat waiting, a fresh coat of paint hiding some of the worst scars from Saipan. Everything looked perfect, except for one critical detail. Johnston wasn't there. Marines were sent to find him. Minutes passed, then more minutes. When they finally located him 30 minutes later, the man who had designed and built the entire mechanism was in his tent, barely conscious, reeking of alcohol. Gunnery Sergeant Sam Johnston was drunk beyond any hope of demonstrating anything. Neiman stood over him, staring down at the man whose ingenuity might save hundreds of Marines, and whose condition now threatened to sink the entire project in front of the division. The demonstration was minutes away, and the flail tank's fate suddenly rested on a man who could barely stand. Gunnery Sergeant Sam Johnston was finished. He'd been drinking through the night, and now lay sprawled in his tent, barely conscious. No amount of coffee, shouting, or cold water would bring him back in time. He wasn't just unfit to demonstrate the flail, he couldn't stand. Neiman checked his watch. 30 minutes. That was all he had before senior officers arrived to judge whether this improvised weapon lived or died. There was no choice. Neiman needed a replacement, immediately. He grabbed the first qualified tank operator he could find, a corporal from another company, a solid Sherman driver who'd been operating tanks since Roy Namor. The man had never seen the flail system before, but he had calm hands and a reputation for learning fast. Neiman pulled him aside. 10 minutes. That's all the training he could give. He walked the corporal through the controls. Quick, precise, no wasted words. This lever engages the flail. This one controls rotation speed. Hydraulics raise and lower the assembly. If anything feels wrong, disengage immediately. The corporal nodded, absorbing everything. No questions. No hesitation. At 0745, the officers began arriving. 2 colonels. 3 lieutenant colonels. A major general from 4th Marine Division headquarters. Infantry battalion commanders who would depend on tanks to survive Iwo Jima. Artillery officers responsible for fire support. Engineer officers tasked with clearing paths under fire. Nearly 30 senior officers took their seats. Some leaned back with folded arms. Some leaned forward with curiosity. A few wore the unmistakable look of men expecting to see a failure. At exactly 0800, Neiman stepped forward. He didn't sell. He didn't dramatize. He briefed the problem. Saipan statistics. 23 tanks lost in the first week. Mine's responsible for the majority. Engineers clearing lanes at 10 yards per minute, under fire. Then he walked them through the solution. The salvage truck axle. The chains. The improvised drive system. The armored differential housing. He explained the testing. 2 minefields. 40 yards each. 0 casualties. Then he stepped back. Demonstration. The replacement driver started the engine. The flail engaged. The axle spun up with its distinctive mechanical roar. The chains lifted, blurred, then slammed into the ground ahead of the tank. The Sherman rolled forward at walking pace. The first mine detonated almost immediately. A towering blast of dirt and smoke. Then another, and another. The explosions came in rapid succession as the flail triggered every buried charge ahead of the hull. The tank disappeared into dust and debris, swallowed by violence. No one spoke. 40 seconds later, the Sherman emerged on the far side. The driver halted. The flail disengaged. The chains slowed and hung still. The mechanism was intact. Several officers stood and walked forward. They inspected the chains, examined the armored differential housing, ran hands over fresh shrapnel scars. Questions followed, practical ones. Maintenance requirements. Chain replacement rates. Salvage compatibility. Spare parts. The Major General crouched near the bow and studied the drive shaft where it passed through the frontal armor. He said nothing for a long moment. Then the officers conferred quietly among themselves. When they finished, the general turned to Neiman. How many of these can you have ready by February? Neiman answered honestly. 1. He explained the constraints. Authorization to modify additional tanks. Access to salvage parts. Manpower. The general nodded. That wasn't a rejection. That was a calculation. And for the first time since Saipan, Neiman knew the minefields of Iwo Jima might not stop the tanks at all. The general didn't hesitate. He would provide both authorization and resources. Division headquarters approved immediate deployment of the flail tank. It would go to Iwo Jima with C Company, 4th Tank Battalion. If it worked in combat, more would be built. If it failed, the experiment would end there. The assault date was set, February 19, 1945. 63 days. That was how long Major Robert Neiman had to prepare an untested, improvised weapon for the most heavily fortified island in the Pacific, and then lead it into combat. January was consumed by preparation. Intelligence reports left no room for optimism. Iwo Jima was 8 square miles of volcanic rock and ash. Mount Suribachi dominated the southern end. 3 airfields cut across the island's center. An estimated 21,000 Japanese defenders had spent months turning the island into a fortress. Their commander, Lieutenant General Tadamaki Kurabayashi, had learned from earlier defeats. He abandoned beach defenses entirely. No bonsai charges. No futile attempts to throw Marines back into the sea. Instead, he built depth. Bunkers buried into ridgelines. Artillery hidden inside caves. Miles of tunnels connecting firing positions. Minefields layered across every likely avenue of approach. Every yard was covered by overlapping fields of fire. American planners knew what this meant. 70,000 Marines would assault the island, 3rd, 4th, and 5th Marine Divisions under 5th Amphibious Corps. It would be the largest Marine operation of the Pacific War, and it would be brutal. The flail tank introduced problems of its own. It was the only diesel-powered Sherman in the 4th Tank Battalion. Every other tank had been converted to the gasoline-powered M4A3. That meant separate fuel supply, different maintenance procedures, and unique spare parts requirements. The flail would need its own logistical tail. The tank was assigned to 2nd Platoon, C Company. Sergeant Rick Haydex was selected to command it in combat. He was a veteran tanker from Saipan and Tinian, calm under fire, methodical, trusted by his crew. He trained extensively with the flail during the final weeks on Maui. Johnston, sober now and fully engaged, drilled him relentlessly on operation and emergency procedures. In late January, the 4th Marine Division embarked. LSTs and transports carried men and machines westward. The voyage took 3 weeks, with staging stops along the way. The flail tank rode in the belly of an LST, chained down beside standard Shermans, looking crude, improvised, out of place. On February 19, 1945, the assault began. At 0640, naval gunfire opened up. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers hammered the island. Carrier aircraft struck inland targets. The bombardment was massive. It was also largely ineffective. Kurabayashi's men stayed underground. At 0900, the first waves landed. On the southern beaches below Suribachi, the 28th Marines came ashore. To the east, the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions hit their assigned sectors. Then reality set in. The volcanic ash was worse than anyone expected. It swallowed boots, bog vehicles, choked engines. Tanks struggled for traction. Infantry waded forward through loose black sand that offered no cover and no stability. And beneath that ash, waiting, were the mines. The sand swallowed everything. Vehicles sank into it. Landing craft stalled short of the shoreline. Marines waded through surf carrying weapons, radios, ammunition, sometimes waist-deep, before they ever reached dry ground. The 4th Tank Battalion began landing at 0930. Sherman tanks rolled off LST ramps into shallow water, engines revving, tracks churning. Many bogged down almost immediately. The volcanic ash was too fine, too loose. It behaved less like sand and more like powder. Tracks spun without traction. 30 tons of steel pressed straight down and disappeared. Neiman's flail tank came ashore at 1015 with C Company, Sergeant Haydex in command. The Sherman cleared the surf but struggled on the beach. In places, the ash was nearly 18 inches deep. Driving through it felt like pushing through flour. The tank sank as it moved, but the additional weight of the flail assembly helped keep the bow from digging in too deeply. It moved slowly, but it moved. By noon, the battalion had 23 Shermans ashore. 8 were stuck and being dug out by engineers. 15 were operational and beginning the push inland. Japanese artillery began finding the range. Mortar rounds fell across the beaches. Shell fragments cut through exposed Marines and equipment. The tanks pushed forward anyway, following infantry elements toward the first objective, Airfield No. 1, roughly half a mile inland. Intelligence reports had been clear. The airfield was surrounded by extensive minefields. C Company advanced through terrain unlike anything encountered before. The black ash shifted under every step. There was no vegetation, no natural cover, just open ground rising gradually toward the airfield. Japanese defensive positions were invisible. Bunkers were buried into the terrain. Gunports hidden behind rocks. Everything was camouflaged to match the volcanic landscape. The advance slowed. Infantry moved ahead of the tanks, probing cautiously. Engineers swept with metal detectors under fire. Every 100 yards took 15 minutes. As the Marines moved farther from the beach, Japanese fire intensified. Mortars, artillery, machine guns firing from concealed positions. Casualties mounted. Haydex kept the flail tank near the lead elements of C Company. The mechanism hadn't been used yet. No confirmed minefield, but no one doubted the mines were there. The only question was where. By 1400 hours, C Company had advanced roughly 400 yards. Airfield number 1 was now clearly visible, a rough strip carved across the ash by Japanese engineers. No aircraft remained. They had been evacuated before the invasion. Still, the airfield mattered. If secured, it would deny the Japanese a staging area and give American forces critical ground to hold against counterattack. Then Haydex saw them. A line of small flags planted in the ground roughly 50 yards ahead, near the southern edge of the airfield. Red fabric tied to wooden stakes. They formed a rough line, perpendicular to his axis of advance. The Japanese had marked the minefield themselves. Training said the flags marked danger. Wire. Trenches. Obstacles. Minefields. Something the Japanese wanted their own troops to avoid or remember. Haydex studied the line of red cloth planted in the ash roughly 50 yards ahead. The spacing was irregular, but the alignment was deliberate. It looked like a boundary. He radioed his platoon commander and requested permission to deploy the flail. If the area was mined, the tank could clear a lane before infantry moved forward. Permission was granted. Haydex ordered his bow gunner to prepare the mechanism. Inside the hull, the drive shaft engaged. The salvage truck axle at the front of the tank began to rotate. Chains lifted off the ground as speed increased, whipping forward in a widening arc. What Haydex did not know was that the flags were not mine markers. They were range markers. Japanese heavy mortars, positioned in concealed, elevated sites roughly 500 yards to the north, had pre-registered the ground. Kurabayashi's defenders had marked distances so mortar crews could adjust fire quickly without recalculating coordinates. When the flail tank moved toward the flags, Japanese observers reported the target immediately. The first mortar round landed 20 yards short. Haydex saw the impact and ordered the driver to increase speed. Get through the suspected minefield before fire adjusted. The second round landed 10 yards closer. The third detonated 5 feet in front of the tank, throwing volcanic ash across the hull and cracking the driver's periscope. More rounds followed. Multiple mortar positions were now firing, overlapping their patterns. The ground around the Sherman erupted in continuous blasts. Fragment impacts rang against the armor. Haydex ordered the driver to reverse. The tracks spun uselessly. The volcanic ash offered no traction, and the added weight of the flail assembly forced the bow deeper into the ground. The tank settled instead of moving. The more power the driver applied, the worse it became. They were immobilized. The flail was still spinning, but the tank could neither advance nor withdraw. Haydex shut down the mechanism to reduce weight on the bow. The driver gunned the engine again. Black ash sprayed into the air, but the tracks found nothing to bite into. Mortar rounds continued to fall. Fragments hammered the hull and turret. Periscopes shattered. The armor held, but the tank was pinned in place with no organic means of escape. The flail tank's first combat engagement had lasted less than 30 minutes, and it was about to end in the ash. Another Sherman from C Company moved forward under fire. The crew attached a tow cable and began pulling the disabled tank backward. The extraction took 20 minutes, conducted under sustained mortar barrage. Once freed, the flail tank withdrew behind a low ridge. The crew inspected the damage. Multiple fragment impacts, a cracked periscope, scorched paint, but the tank was still operational. The flail mechanism was intact. It would not be used again. That was the first and last combat employment of the improvised mine-clearing tank on Iwo Jima. The terrain made its limitations unavoidable. The volcanic ash robbed heavily loaded vehicles of mobility. The flail assembly added too much weight to the bow, and most Japanese minefields were positioned on higher ground where the ash was even deeper. Combat engineers, working slowly with metal detectors under fire, proved more effective despite the cost. The battle for Iwo Jima lasted 36 days. It ended on March 26, 1945. Nearly 7,000 Americans were killed. More than 20,000 were wounded. Of the 21,000 Japanese defenders, only 216 were captured alive. The battle produced 27 Medals of Honor, more than any other single engagement in American history. Admiral Chester Nimitz would later say that on Iwo Jima, uncommon valor was a common virtue. Neiman survived the campaign. He continued commanding tanks through the final months of the war, including occupation duty in North China. He later received the Navy Cross for his actions on Saipan, where he abandoned 2 disabled tanks under fire and continued the attack. He left the Marine Corps in 1946. The flail tank he built from salvaged parts never achieved the battlefield success he hoped for, but the concept endured. Mine-clearing flails were built for the planned invasion of Japan. Those operations were canceled when the war ended. Modern mine-clearing vehicles still use the same principle, rotating chains detonating explosives ahead of the vehicle, an idea born in a motor pool on Maui. The 4th Tank Battalion lost 33 Shermans on Iwo Jima, some to mines, most to anti-tank guns and artillery. But they supported the infantry. They destroyed fortifications. And they kept moving forward when stopping would have been easier.